Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint the scene of a serene lake. Last year, I think someone requested that I paint water with rocks or pebbles underneath the water. So let's start by masking off the sides. I'm just using washi tape here, or you can also use masking tape before we sketch and paint. Because the tape that I'm using is fairly thin, I'm going to secure the sides with some clips as well. On the left is the image that inspired me for this painting, but I'm going to create my own composition using the elements that is shown here. You can see my sketchbook peeking on the left. That is because I created a small thumbnail for the composition that I'm going to create here. I really like the idea of having some larger rocks sitting on top of the water so we can see the difference in color and texture. I also added some vegetation in the foreground, and I'm going to create a little island on the left before adding the forest and mountains in the background. I'm just doing light, simple silhouettes of these elements and not getting into too much detail. I'm also holding my pencil really far back so I don't accidentally press into the paper. These are just indications of where things are going to be for the sake of composition, and I will also have the outline in my coffee shop in case anyone is interested. For the color, I'm going to be using Azure Blue by White Nights, Vermilion by Holbein, Sepia by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Prussian Blue by Holbein, and Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. I'm going to start with the sky. I dampen the surface evenly and use a medium to thick consistency of Prussian blue, and I start painting from the top down. As I was applying the paint though, I feel like this is quite pigmented, so once I reach the top of the mountain, I'm going to clean my brush and pull the paint downwards to cover the mountains, and I'm going to stop where I've allocated the space for the distant forest. I want the sky to the mountain to have a gradient, so you can see that the top is darker and it gets lighter as I get towards the mountain. Once I'm done, I just rolled up some tissue to lift some paint off the damp surface to create the shape of the clouds. I'm just roughly following the reference image here since there isn't much space for the sky. While I still have this bit of tissue, I also felt like the mountain was a little bit too wet for my liking. It was also a bit too dark, so I took off the excess paint with tissue. This won't completely dry the surface, it will just be a little bit less damp and a bit more controllable. Now I'm going to paint the mountains, and for this I used a mix of Prussian blue with a little bit of Hansa yellow, but it's still mostly blue, but you can see the difference in the tone compared to the sky where I just used Prussian blue by itself. When I paint the mountains, I like to start by outlining the shape of the mountains, then I use a clean damp brush to pull the paint downwards. I'm going to leave the mountain right at the back for now and move on to paint the forest area. I'm using the same color mixture, but as you can see, this has much more Hansa yellow, so the color is turning green. On the left, I use this really light green, and you can see that random oval. That's because I want to paint a tree there, so I'm just indicating the space, and I'm using a mixture with a little bit more Prussian blue to paint around it. For the island on the left, I decided to start with the light yellow-green for the bottom part. Then for the top part, I'm going to use a slightly darker green, but this time I'm going to mute the color by mixing a bit of sepia. After doing this, I feel like the sky should be completely dry by now, so I'm going to paint the mountain at the back using the same mixture as before, starting with the outline, then using a clean damp brush to pull the paint downwards. Next, I'm going to paint the vegetation in the foreground. I've taken some Hansa yellow, vermilion, and a bit of sepia on my palette, and a bit of Prussian blue for a different tone of green. With these colors, you can always play with the ratio of the mixtures in order to create different tones of greens. I always like to start with the lightest tone, which is the yellow-green with a lot of Hansa yellow in the ratio. Then I like to darken the bottom part of the vegetation most of the time with something that is a little bit more muted, which is why I added more sepia in the mixture. I'm going to do the same thing for this one. You can also create layers of this, so you can see I'm painting the darker muted tone in between the lighter greens. While painting this, I like to pay attention to the edges, making sure that they look organic and natural. I like to pay attention especially to the height differences, making sure that it goes up and down naturally, and also the textures along the edges. For a nice, really subtle pop of color, while the surface is still damp, sometimes I like to dab in a little bit of vermilion along the edges. I'm going to do more or less the same thing with the shrub behind, and to show the layers, ideally you do want the ones in front to be completely dry so the paint doesn't bleed into each other, but since I was being lazy, you can see that some areas are merging into each other as the wet paint touch, so I'm going to stop this spread by dabbing off some of the excess paint with tissue. Next, I'm going to paint the stones around the vegetation, and for this I'm using a mix of sepia with vermilion and a little bit of Prussian blue. I'm just using a very thin consistency for the base. Then I'm going to take advantage of this damp surface by using a thicker consistency mix of vermilion and Prussian blue, and I'm going to imagine the stones having different surfaces by drawing the shapes and painting the areas in shadow at the bottom with this darker value. Just like the shrubs, I like to play with the ratio of the color mixtures. If you want the stones to look a bit more gray, I would just use Prussian blue and sepia in a very thin consistency. And if you want it to look a bit more brown, I would add more sepia and vermilion. I like to layer the colors for the stone so I can slowly build up the form. So I'm starting with a thin consistency as the base, and sometimes I like to lightly dab off some paint with tissue in order to create some textures. For these stones, I generally want the bottom to be darker. So I sometimes like to just paint the bottom part first and then use a clean damp brush to pull some of the paint upwards. I've painted these stones very lightly, so they're not super wet. However, the surface is still a tad damp, and I'm going to add some darker values to slowly carve out the shape of the stone textures. I'm just going to wait for these stones to dry, and meanwhile I'm going to mix up a lot of green on my palette, and I'm separating the areas so I have easy access to the different tones of greens. I'm going to paint some trees on the island as well as the background. Starting with the island, since it's in front, I'm using this light yellow green to create a large tree, with the lighter yellow green on the right and the darker value on the left. And here I'm just going to somewhat see the shapes that I already have and try to create different textures to somewhat make up some shrubs and add some small pine trees in the back. For the smaller pine trees, I like to use a thicker consistency and a dark value so it stands out against the shrubs in front. Next, I'm going to paint some pine trees in the background as well, but I want to make sure that the island is completely dry, so I just used a hairdryer. I like to paint some larger ones in front, and for the really tiny distant ones, I don't really paint the individual pine trees, but I kind of just treat it as lines that is somewhat forming triangles in the background. With a darker value of the same color and a thicker consistency, I like to paint the left side to add some shadows and form. I like to pair up the pine trees with some distant trees as well. Here I'm only showing the top of the trees, so they kind of look like distant shrubs. And you can also play with different green tones, but I just want to make sure that the trees are painted with a darker value so they look separate from the land, which I'm going to keep as the lighter greens. As you can tell, I'm not really following the reference fully, but I like to take certain elements as ideas and to figure out what kind of landscape I can create in my composition. I personally like to create some rows of the pine trees to add density to the forest. I just find that by doing this, the pine forest will look a bit more believable so it doesn't look too flat. Moving along, next I'm going to paint the mountains. I'm just going to use the same mix as before, but as you can tell, it has more Prussian blue. And I'm just going to create textures, leaving out some negative space for the background color to still show through. I'm somewhat treating this as the stones before, basically slowly layering darker values as I carve the shape of the mountains. And each time I add a new layer, I try to use a slightly thicker consistency to slowly define the structure. Here, as I'm layering a bit more detail, I like to work on a completely dry surface so the edges that I create as I carve the shape is more defined and sharp. I'm fairly happy with the surrounding area, so next I'm going to start painting the water. For this, I'm going to dampen the surface evenly. You can use a larger brush compared to what I'm using to make this process quicker. Loosely dampening the space in between the stones. I don't want extra water sitting on top of the paper and puddle, but I want the paper to be somewhat just cold to the touch. For the color, I like to use a mixture of Azure blue and Prussian blue in a thick consistency. And with this mixture, I've added it to the green that is already on my palette. I find that this just lowers the saturation ever so slightly, so the color is a bit more consistent with the surrounding area of the painting. To paint the water, I use the reference as guide so I know when to start changing the color, because I feel like the color change will help with the perception of depth and distance. And I also can see white spots on the right hand side, which is some water reflection. So I just took the excess off with tissue. As I get towards the bottom, I'm going to start adding more Hansa yellow in the mixture. So there's a gradual change to more of a green tone, but I'm also going to use a thinner consistency as I get closer to the foreground so I can paint the stones underneath the water. As I get closer to the foreground, I want to be very careful to paint around the edges of the stones as well as the shrubs, so this green doesn't muddy up the color. In between the stones, I started adding a touch of vermilion. This will just make the color a little bit more earthy, and just like before, I used a very thin consistency. I'm just going to neaten out the white spot on top, then I'm going to dry everything off. We've covered the base of this whole painting, so next I'm going to start adding on the details, especially around the islands and the forest in the background. Since I already have all of the elements that I want for these areas, I'm just going to define them further with a darker value. And this is just the same green with added sepia and vermilion, so the color is more muted. At the bottom here, I just added more vermilion for more of a brown color for the land. And I'm also going to separate the island where the trees are touching with the background. Just like the island, I added more of this dark brown underneath the land, and this just helps to lift the land so they don't look like they're part of the water. I'm fairly happy with the background and the greeneries, so next I'm going to paint the water texture at the far distance. Since I've already left out that white space, now I'm going to paint over it with some thin horizontal lines using the previous color mixture from Azure blue and Prussian blue with a little bit of the green. And again, I'm using the reference as guide to give me ideas where to place these darker values. To paint these small lines, I find it so much easier to paint using my synthetic brush since the bristles are quite snappy and they don't pick up too much paint. But as I get closer to the bottom, I'm going to switch to my softer bristles with a slightly larger size. As I move on, I've switched my brush and I can see in the reference that there's this triangular negative space. I think it's from the reflection of the mountain, so I'm going to do something similar, but I'm going to paint it underneath the island. I'm still painting horizontally, so even if my paint bleed into each other, the negative space that I leave out will still add to the water texture. As I get towards the center, I added a bit of Hansa yellow in the color, and since I still want the water in the foreground to be very light, I just softened the blend of the turquoise mixture into the base color with a clean damp brush. After layering more of the darker values, now I can see the gradual change a little bit better, and once I'm done, I'm just going to dry it off completely. Finally, on to my favorite part of the painting, the stones underneath the water. For the ones on the deeper end, I like to create really flat ovals for the stones, and I want to make the shapes larger and more rounded as we get closer to our viewpoint, since when it's closer, we are able to see more of the top of the stone. As for the color on the deeper end, since the water looks a bit more of a deeper blue, I like to use the color that I use for the mountains, and as it gets closer to us and closer to the shore where the water is a bit more shallow, I'm going to add more Hansa yellow with some vermilion and sepia. I also use a thinner consistency as it gets closer to us because the shallow water will generally look more clear instead of blue. And for the stones, I give them a little bit more structure as it gets closer to us as well. I try to randomize the shape a little bit more compared to the ones further away, which I just tried to indicate with oval shapes. These stones should look like a blobby mess at this point, but now I'm going to add a little bit more definition to them. I'm still using the greens that I already have on my palette, but I am using a thicker consistency. And this time I tried to paint in between the stones that I just painted on top of each other, and I'm trying to define the ovals and separate them. I found this part of the painting so fun because it's quite intuitive, and I'm taking advantage of where certain colors might bleed or travel, because sometimes you can actually enhance certain textures from those accidents and turn them into something that looks a bit more organic. After the simple step of just somewhat outlining the bottom part of those ovals to separate them and enhance the shape, you can start to see where it's going. So now I'm just going to use an even darker and a thicker consistency to define the form of these stones. You can see that most of these are not perfect ovals. I want them to look slightly different from each other so they look more organic, especially the stones closer to our viewpoint. For smaller details, I like to use my smaller brush just so it's easier to control the flow of paint out of my bristles, and I'm just going to do this layer by layer. If I feel like I have enough structure for certain areas but they're too big, I'm going to just break them down further and separate them to create cracks and other textures. After adding some definitions for the stones which are underwater, now I feel like the stones on top of the water are falling flat. So now I'm going to define these as well, still using the same mixtures as before, which is from sepia, Prussian blue, and vermilion. And I like to play with different ratios in order to get slightly different tones. This is also when I can start adding some cracks and more textures to these stones, since I'm painting on a completely dry surface, so the edges can be a bit sharper. And if I want to blend some colors, I will just use a clean damp brush and smudge those specific edges. I like to work from light to dark and placing the darker values on the deepest areas between the stones. I feel like some of these stones above the water look kind of like they're floating, so to make it look like it's sitting on top of other stones in the water, I used a bit of dark blue to cover parts of the bottom of these stones. Now going back to the green shrubs, I'm going to use a muted dark green to separate the layers so they don't look like flat green blobs. While doing this, I like to really take care of the edges or the tips of these shrubs where they are touching, making sure that the textures painted around it looks natural. Then using the same color with added Hansa yellow to create a brighter green, I like to add extra textures to these shrubs as well. Since they're in the foreground, I'm just going to add a bit more detail. I added vermilion to the green mix on my palette, and I'm going to add some very small branches. And to make these branches look like part of the shrubs, I'm going to attach some additional leaves. At the moment, the water feels pretty still, but I want to add some movement, so I'm going to paint on some ripples, especially around the edges of these stones. For the ripples, I use some Prussian blue with a bit of green that I already have on my palette, and I'm going to use a medium consistency. Since the water is not directly under our viewpoint, I want to make sure that there's some flatness to the ripples. So I'm imagining flat ovals instead of full circles, but it does get a bit more circular as it gets closer to our viewpoint and flatter with more distance. I imagine as the water hits these stones, you might probably see some reflective areas, so I'm going to add really thin white lines next to these darker blues. After this, I feel like I'm done, but I just want to balance everything out as a whole. And I'm going to add a bit more definition to the stones which are underwater to balance the amount of detail that I've added for the elements on top of the water. Now towards the end, I felt like I've lost the contrast in the darker values of the water, which in my opinion makes the area in the middle looks a little bit awkward in terms of perspective. I noticed this on the left side, however, I didn't notice that I had the same problem on the right, so I went ahead and unmasked the painting. But once I've done that, I decided to layer on more of a darker value on the right hand side. Sadly though, I was overthinking it and I think I've accidentally overworked that area instead, because I feel like even at its thickest consistency, the value just wasn't as dark as I want it to be. Maybe next time I would actually just add a bit of sepia in the dark blue mix, or maybe even some indigo. But yeah, here I was still trying to salvage it. I was quite nervous of painting right to the very edge of the paper. While I was adding the darker value, sometimes I feel like it's starting to look out of place, so I tried to salvage it by adding more water texture as well, by painting some dashed lines with a thicker consistency along the sides where the values are darker, and a thinner consistency with the dashed lines being a bit more distance apart at the center. And I just had to stop myself here because I realized I was doing a bit too much. In general, I was pretty happy with the method that I've used to approach this scene. And I hope this tutorial was also useful for you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing for more. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!